Welcome to Magnifico Recaps. Today we will narrate a crime drama movie called Catch Me If You Can. Spoilers ahead. So take care. The movie opens with an episode of To Tell the Truth from 1977. Three contestants claim to be Frank William Abagnale, an impersonator of an airline pilot, lawyer, and doctor. He also scammed people across 3 continents for millions in money, all before he was 19. Frank is asked about his catch and reveals that he was Carl Hanratty. The film shifts to 1969 when Carl Hanratty, an FBI agent, arrives at a French prison in order to extradite Frank Abagnale Jr., a flu-stricken man. He tries to escape but is too sick for him to make it outside. Frank surrenders to Carl and asks him to take him home. The film flashes back 6 years ago. Frank Abagnale Jr., 16 years old, lives in New Rochelle with his father Frank Abagnale Sr. and his mother Paula from France. Frank loves his father and is proud to have him inducted into the New Rochelle Rotary Club Wall of Honor as a lifetime club member. Frank's father wakes him up in the morning and takes him to a shop where Frank watches his father con a woman into lending him the black suit. Frank then drives his father to Chase Manhattan Bank wearing the suit and pretending that he is his chauffeur. This is a scheme to impress the bank staff and secure a loan. Frank Sr.'s series of IRS tax frauds causes the loan to be denied and the family must move to a smaller apartment. This creates tension between Frank and his parents. Frank enrolls in a public school and shows up to his first day wearing the uniform he wore at his old school. Frank is then accosted by some classmates who make fun of his uniform and say it makes him look like a substitute teacher. He walks up to the front of class pretending to be the substitute teacher. The real substitute teacher was even sent away, claiming that there was a mistake. Frank's ruse continues for over a week before Frank is discovered and his parents are called to discuss the matter. His mother is not happy about this, but Frank's father is impressed at how far his son went with the con. Frank discovers his mother and father having an affair while returning from school one day. Frank's mother tries to get him to silence, but Frank is too upset to care. Frank returns home soon after to discover that his parents have filed for divorce. Frank flees from his home when asked which parent he would like to live with. He uses his checkbook to get shelter and transportation. Frank runs out of money quickly, so he creates fake checks with his own checkbook and then attempts to convince bank tellers to trust him. After yet another failure, he notices some airline pilots and stewardesses who are checking into a hotel. Frank is inspired by the way they get treated like royalty everywhere they go. Frank concocts his way to obtaining Pan Am Airlines pilot's uniform. He then learns more about Pan Am Airlines by pretending to be an undergraduate doing a report and interviewing a former pilot. Frank uses his Pan Am knowledge and uniform to create fake Pan Am checks that he was able to cash at various banks and hotels throughout New York. Even a bank manager who rejected Frank earlier falls for the con. Frank attempts to do the same check scam at an airport but is confused by a deadhead pilot headed to Miami. Frank accepts it and has his first flight. He then has his first encounter with a stewardess. Frank discovers valuable information about check routing by flirting openly with a bank teller in Miami. Frank then buys a check coding machine at an auction. He uses it to develop his plans and create checks with larger amounts. Carl Hanratty is a persistent, but almost insane, FBI agent who has discovered Frank's check fraud. He tracks the latest fraudulent check to a hotel where he discovers that Frank is still a resident. Frank appears in a suit from the bathroom and, knowing that Carl is from FBI, Frank pretends to being Agent Barry Allen from the United States Secret Service. He brazenly claims to have caught the suspect just before Carl arrived. Carl is only aware of his mistake after Frank has fled the room. After the encounter, Carl's description and the information in the area don't provide any clues. Fingerprints taken in the room do not lead anywhere. Frank discovers that he has many nicknames. He is known as the Skywayman or the James Bond. Frank is inspired by the title and purchases a Bond-style suit as well as an Aston Martin car that he rides for joy. He meets Cheryl Ann, a magazine model, at the hotel where he is staying. He offers her to spend the night with her for $1,000, but she claims that he only has $1,400. Cheryl requests that Frank endorse it to her and that she pay $400 in cash. This results in Frank actually sleeping with Cheryl. Frank quickly tries to use the stolen money to reunite his parents. Frank invites his father to dinner at a fancy restaurant and gives him the keys for a new Cadillac. Frank Sr. explains that he cannot accept the gift because the IRS are still watching him and that Paula won't talk to him. A few months later, on Christmas Eve, Carl was working alone in the FBI office when Frank called to apologize for his tricking him at the hotel. Frank dares Carl to meet him face to face, but Carl refuses to accept his apology. Frank tells Carl his room number and location, but Carl refuses to believe him. As the conversation goes on, Carl quickly realizes why Frank called. Frank doesn't have anyone else to talk with. Frank hangs up and Carl continues with his investigation with renewed vitality. Later, Carl discovers that Barry Allen is a character on The Flash, and speculates that Frank could be a minor. This explains why they have not been able to find any record of him, or match his fingerprints. Carl recalls Frank making a reference to the New York Yankees in their phone conversation. He has his men search for runaways around the New York region. They eventually find Frank's mother, who has remarried Jack Barnes. Carl recognizes Frank immediately and knows his suspect after seeing Frank's yearbook photo. Frank's mother then learns that Frank had already robbed them of approximately $1.3 million through check fraud. Frank later meets Brenda Strong, a young nurse at the hospital, and they become friends. By pretending to be a doctor, he enrolls at the hospital with a fake Harvard Medical School diploma and a convincing resume. He is hired to be the emergency room night administrator. Brenda is also on his staff. Frank has no medical experience or knowledge, but he is able to get the medical interns to make the calls for him. This allows him to handle the administrative aspects of the hospital without touching patients. He eventually wins Brenda over and they fall in love. Frank proposes to Brenda to help her come to terms with the fact that her parents disowned her for having an abortion in the past. Frank's father refuses to let Carl go, and Carl continues to visit him. Carl receives a letter from Frank containing his Atlanta address. Frank's address takes Carl and his team to Frank's house, but Frank had already traveled to Louisiana to visit Brenda's parents. Frank's Harvard diploma is noticed by Carl, who takes Frank to the hospital that Frank has left. Frank and Brenda visit her parents in Louisiana. Frank claims that he is a Lutheran just like them. He also says that he is a qualified doctor and lawyer. Roger, Brenda's father, questions Frank about his feelings. Frank then admits that he isn't a lawyer, doctor, or co-pilot. Roger views it as a romantic gesture and gives his daughter his hand. Frank passes the bar exam, and he joins Roger's firm as an assistant procurer. Frank returns to New York to tell his father about the engagement as preparations continue for the wedding. Frank Sr., who is now an employee at the U.S. Post Office and is still having problems with the IRS, tells his son that his mother, Jack Barnes, has been married to him and moved on. This shocks Frank. He also revealed that he had a visit from FBI and knew what Frank was doing. Frank Sr. urges Frank to continue, but his father refuses to listen. Frank Sr. leaves Frank Sr., furious that his father cannot act like a father. Frank calls Carl at FBI on Christmas Eve. He has been waiting for the call and has his staff listening in. Frank tells Carl he's done and is settling down. He also asks Carl to quit chasing him. Frank has stolen $4 million by this time. Carl tells him this is impossible. Frank realizes he was wrong and hangs up. He had not told Carl about the engagement. Frank's alias was found in Atlanta by Carl. He figured that Frank needed to keep it when he moved to Louisiana because he is currently dating a girl who believes it to be his real name. Changing his name would raise too many questions. After going through the wedding announcements, Carl and his guys track Frank down. Frank then confesses to Brenda that he is the man he claims to be. He then flees out of a window and asks Brenda to meet him at the airport a few days later. Frank arrives at the airport as scheduled and is shocked to discover that Brenda is being closely monitored by a few disguised FBI agents. Frank is not present, so Carl sends his men to stake out the airport. He is certain Frank will try to find him and then attempt to flee by plane. Frank devises a new plan. He pretends to be a Pan Am pilot and visits a local college in order to recruit stewardesses for his trip to Europe. He conducts auditions and selects the most beautiful girls he can find. Then he dresses them in uniforms. Then he goes to the airport and walks amongst the crowd, using the girls as eye candy, distracting agents from even looking at him. Frank walks right past Carl's men, and he escapes to Europe. To further confuse Carl, he also uses a decoy at the unloading zone. 7 months later in 1967, Carl informs Frank that Frank had been forging checks across the Eastern Hemisphere. The checks prove to be real this time. Frank claims that Frank is out of control and asks for permission to find him in Europe. However, his boss denies him permission. He cites that if Frank can't be caught in the U.S.A., then he won't be able to catch Frank in Europe. Frank refuses to quit and Carl takes Frank's fake checks to professional printers. They deduced from the quality that the check was printed on a particular type of printer that is available only in a few European countries, including France. Frank's mother told Carl in an interview that Frank was born in France. Carl then travels to Montréal, where Frank is found inside a huge printing plant, producing thousands upon thousands of checks. Frank is told by Carl that he was with the French police. He promised to take him into custody. Frank believes Carl lies, but Carl convinces Frank that he will be killed if he leaves the factory without Carl. Frank agrees to handcuff him and Carl takes him outside. He compliments Carl for his ability to fool him. Frank is taken to jail by the French police almost immediately. Carl promises to extradite Frank back to the U.S.A. Frank is released to Carl's custody after 2 years. The film opens with Frank being taken into Carl's care. Frank is then flown into the United States on Christmas Eve 1969 by the extradited plane. Frank, who has repeatedly asked Carl to call his father several times, is informed by Carl that Frank Sr. had died accidentally while they were about to land. Frank, distraught, locks himself in the bathroom of the plane and escapes to find his mother. Frank escapes to Barnes, where he finds his mother, happy married to her second husband. She now has a young girl, which Frank discovers is his half-sister. Frank, realizing that his father is dead, surrenders to Carl and the police, who arrest him before his mom and new family members can discover his true identity. Frank is finally tried and convicted. He was sentenced to 12-year imprisonment in an Atlanta federal maximum security prison. Frank is visited by Carl every Christmas for the next 4 years. Frank quickly identifies the forger Carl is after by simply looking at a check Carl casually shows him. This gives the FBI agent a clue. Carl later visits Frank with his boss. He is given a fake check, which he promptly identifies as such. This makes Carl smile. Carl made arrangements for Frank to be released from prison in 1974 and allowed him to work for the FBI's check fraud section under Carl's supervision. Frank is released from prison but is still chained to his desk job, and misses the excitement of his former life. Frank is tempted to pretend that he's an airline pilot again after he comes across a pilot uniform. Carl stops Frank just as he is about to fly away. Frank is allowed to leave, and Carl predicts that Frank will return to work Monday morning since there isn't anyone following him. Carl is anxious when Frank fails to show up at work on Monday morning. Frank eventually shows up and they begin to examine a newly discovered check forgery. This forgery demonstrates new techniques that they have never seen before. Frank asks Carl a question that has been bothering him for years. He wants to know how he cheated the Louisiana bar exam in order to become a lawyer. Frank says he didn't cheat and claims that he studied hard for the exam and was able to pass it on his merits. Carl wants to know the truth. Frank insists that he is focused on the facts and continues to press on. The scrolling text reveals that Frank has been happily married 26 years, had 3 children, lives with his family in the Midwest, and is good friends with Carl. He is also known for creating unforgeable checks, which means he receives millions of dollars every year.